How strong is the evidence for levitation?
The sheer number of people who say this happened and then give you details is so large, it's more difficult to conceive of that many people lying.
My Buddhist friends and masters I had studied with, and they all gave me direct testimony that they saw levitation.
The Buddhist monks do this. In India, the yogis do it. The Sufis do it in Islam. The Kabbalists did it in Judaism. All those CIA files are now at Rice University.
They're conclusive that remote viewing can be done?
They got hits, yes, they got hits. They wouldn't have kept doing it for over 20 years if they didn't.
The reason I got interested in miracles to begin with was through my study of science.
Blaise Pascal, great scientist, great mathematician, but very much a believer in the miraculous. He was something of a mystic himself.
Yale's Carlos Eire is one of the most respected historians in the country, who's known for his methodical and rigorous scholarship of early modern Europe. His latest book, however, takes on a far more fantastical subject, the history of levitation. And its thesis is captured in its shocking title, They Flew. Humans actually levitated. Now, before I picked up this book, I was so skeptical that something like this could even be studied, let alone be true. But after combing through the mountains of evidence and grilling him for 2.5 hours, I walked away believing in the possibility of levitation. In fact, studying this book led me to witness what I think to be a literal miracle with my own eyes, which I'll talk about at the beginning of this interview. If you listen to this conversation with an open mind, you'll see how investigating the supernatural is far from trivial, but one of the most fundamental questions at the heart of intellectual history, philosophy, and politics. So even if you walk away completely unconvinced of the reality of miracles in history, you're going to gain a profound appreciation for how thinking about the miraculous has shaped history.
How strong is the historical evidence that someone actually levitated?
Well, the evidence is there across time and across cultures. This is not just a Christian phenomenon. And as a matter of fact, whenever I would tell my colleagues who work in Asian religions about my project, their response was that they were totally nonplussed. And they're like, yes, of course. Of course, you know, this is what happens to holy people. So we've got plenty of evidence. Nobody knows for sure how many have been recorded and who records them and how they're recorded until we get to the 16th century and the new canonization process, which makes the hagiographies, because that's what we had before, lives of saints, technical term, hagiography, from the Greek hagios. So the closer you get to the 16th century, throughout say the medieval period from 11th century to 16th century, yes, there are numerous hagiographies, and they're not as trustworthy about accounts of levitation as the stories that come after the canonization system is put into place.
So when you say that the evidence and the strength of the evidence for levitation varies, let's just talk about the Christian tradition, widely across different accounts, what do you think are the most compelling accounts? That is the hardest to imagine that this was fraudulent, like single events of levitation?
Several conditions make certain levitations more believable. The extremity of vertical distance, as well as horizontal distance covered by levitators, especially in large spaces, or even more convincing, outdoors, where it is difficult to imagine any equipment that could have been rigged up. Small levitations, let's say, a foot off the ground, it's faked all the time. One of my fraudulent nuns actually faked it with platform shoes. Inside her habit, nobody could see she was wearing platform shoes. So they're, oh, you're taller, you must be up in the air. So it's the circumstances and the extent of levitating that make it less possible that this could have been staged, which then leaves you with the option. Okay, so are the testimonies all lies or not?
Right.
And this is where, some critics of my book have said, not only that I am passing off the testimony of liars as true, but even worse, I know they're lying. Yet,
right. You're also in on it.
Yes,
You're
I'm also in on it. Yes, yeah. I'm lying too. So you can't win, right?
Right. So those are the things that you look for, right? The extremity, basically how difficult it is to fake, and then how good are the testimonies.
Right.
Can you tell a few stories about the accounts of levitation that you think fulfill these criteria the best?
Yeah, well, Joseph of Cupertino wins the prize, hands down, because he will rise to the very top of a large church, inside to the ceiling. Mm-hmm. He will go forwards and backwards, up several feet above the floor, like literally flying backwards and forwards, sideways. Outdoors, there's one event which has been depicted in several paintings of Joseph of Cupertino, sees that these workmen are trying to erect a very large cross outdoors, basically like a large life-size cross. And they're having trouble, it's too heavy. So he flies up to them, picks up the cross, and puts it in the hole they had dug for it. And this is one of the most oft-represented levitations of Joseph of Cupertino. It's hard not to compare him to Superman in the Superman comic books, in the 20th century. But there's one that is also described in the canonization inquest of him seeing a lamb and taking the lamb in his arms and going up outdoors with the lamb in his arms and ending up on a tree and then coming out of his ecstasy in the tree and having to be rescued with a tall ladder to come down from the tree.
And what was the testimony for these instances? Was it the workmen? Was there one person in this time?
For the one with the workmen, there were workmen and the people who saw this happen in that location. And I think that was kind of when he was in his younger years. I'm not too clear on the chronology of each of these, but the lamb occurred, I think, in front of a substantial number of people who then testified at the inquest. Because, in the case of Joseph Cupertino's life, he kept being sent from one place to another. So the inquest had to be distributed. The questionnaire had to be distributed in different places. And you have different eyewitnesses in different crowds who testified to this or that miracle. The lamb one is one. There's another where a young man who was having, we would call them psychological problems or psychiatric problems. He was insane. Joseph puts his hand on his head to cure him, and he goes up with the young man. He goes up with Joseph. They stay up there for a while, and it's a double miracle. He's healed, and it's this double levitation.
Right. And there are also instances in Joseph's history that you mentioned in the book where there's a lot of trustworthy civic authorities like prince and dukes. Let me just quote you your book and share one of these stories. After meeting with Joseph in his cell, Juan Alfonso, the Count Duke Viceroy, reported to his wife, who was traveling with him, "I have seen and spoken with another Saint Francis." Enthralled by such an assessment of Joseph, the wife begged for an audience with him. Ordered to meet with her and her ladies-in-waiting in the Basilica of St. Francis, Joseph complied, saying, "I know not whether I will be able to speak due to his aversion to mingling with females." But as it turned out, Joseph never had to utter a word or come close to any woman, for as soon as he entered the huge church through a side door, he shrieked and flew 12 feet above the heads of his illustrious visitors, hovered for a while in ecstasy before an image of the Virgin Mary, shrieked again, flew back to his takeoff point near the door, and returned to his cell silently, his head bowed, his face hidden from view by his cowl. The Count Duke Viceroy's wife and all the ladies in her retinue fainted, and the Count Duke Viceroy simply stood still, in a stupor, with his arms spread wide, bereft of all feeling, as if somewhere between life and death. Meanwhile, the Viceroy's wife had to be revived with smelling salts and a generous amount of holy water sprinkled on her face. So for a lot of these events, there's a large retinue, a royal retinue in attendance.
Oh, yes, yeah. And not only that, there's a long list of requests being made by powerful people to visit Joseph of Cupertino. And it's actually mentioned as one of the reasons that he had to be moved from Assisi to a more remote location, because at Assisi, the superior of all the Franciscans has to handle these requests. Now, how do you turn down powerful people? It's difficult. And all sorts of nobility, especially, request permission to come visit Joseph. And Joseph is, basically a burden. At this point, becomes a burden to this Franciscan community, because all these nobles have to be put up in the proper kind of rooms. And room has to be made for their retinues, and so on and so forth. It becomes so complicated, they start turning down important people. And these important people, of course, like all important people, make noises to the higher up. They're probably, sending letters to Rome saying, "What's with this? I was not allowed to come to Assisi to," and it's just too much of a burden.
Right. That's what I was really surprised by the relationship between these miracle workers and the church or the monasteries they were in, was that even when the church didn't think they were demonic or fraudulent, their relationship was still very uneasy. Like it was almost hostile. And that's very counterintuitive, because you'd think that the church would be glad to have these peoples, these literal signs from God there. But the relationship is actually a lot more hostile than you think. Literally put in a cell he was, right, in some of these instances.
In the case of Joseph of Cupertino, he ends his life in a very remote location, kept in his room 7 days a week. Except for Sunday, he gets to attend Mass with all his confreres, his fellow Franciscans. The rest of the time, he is in solitary confinement. Mm-hmm. And they give him they actually give him a suite. We call it a suite because there's his bedroom and then a room that has been turned into a small chapel, so he can say Mass by himself. Mm. And there is such a thing as too much. Right? Too much of a miracle creates high demand for this miracle. And we find very similar syndrome described, especially in the 3 synoptic gospels of Jesus, that he just had to get away. He was in such high demand, he had to get away and went to, it's usually in English translated as a lonely place or a remote place. He just had to flee the crowds. Miracle workers, this is what can happen. So in the case of Joseph, I don't, hostility might be too strong a term.
Right.
But
it wasn't anything malicious. It wasn't they were jealous or they were like, right. It was to protect him, it sounds like.
It's a friction. There's friction. It creates friction. To have someone who is well known.
So let's examine this case very carefully about Joseph. How are these events relayed to us? Can you trace the sort of the trail of evidence? Because the only books we have or the material we have on Joseph are people who already believe that he's a saint, right? So do we process all of the questions and answers from those books, or do we have the firsthand written accounts from some of these dukes saying, "Oh my God, I saw this guy fly"?
It's fragmentary at first. And nobody's busy collecting these things until Joseph dies. The dating of the beatification and canonization inquests are close enough in time to his having been alive that there are still witnesses alive to testify with the inquest. Then there are hagiographies. The first one written doesn't rely that much on the inquests. As we move forward in time, there are two more after that that actually rely heavily on the inquest and actually cite the inquests and cite the testimony, quoting it, of specific people who answered in great detail in the inquest the question, what did you see? So it's like these fragments travel through time in two tracks. There's the track of people who remember relaying the information orally. There's the oral dimension. Then the other track is the written, which is piecemeal at first, but then collected in a very systematic fashion for beatification and canonization. And then the hagiographies written, which rely on these documents for the narrative.
Right. And so, again, I just want to double click on this because I agree with you. This, I think, is the most compelling case for the fact that someone actually levitated. So the evidence goes, people who are still alive who saw St. Joseph levitate were grilled and cross-examined, essentially, in one of these canonization inquests. And that was cited by the hagiographies. And that is what we have access to. So we have access to the hagiographies, not the inquest documents, but we have direct citations of the inquests. So if someone in the inquests, because these books, the hagiographies are to argue that someone is a saint from people who are believers. If during the inquest, some people answered in a negative way, like, oh, this guy didn't fly, or I saw him use a pulley once, would that have gotten to us, or is that skewed? Is his hagiography is another layer of processing?
That's a very good question. And let's separate Teresa of Avila, whose inquest has been published, 3 volumes. I have them.
And these are just printed, straight up manuscripts and all the documentation.
The manuscripts were, transcribed and printed. In the case of Joseph, we don't have that. But in the case of Joseph, we have the quotations in the hagiographies, plus late 20th, early 21st century, a man who dedicated his life to researching the actual inquests in Rome and citing them extensively. He is a window through which we see these testimonies. So I accessed the inquests differently in these cases. In the case of Teresa,
direct,
because it's direct and complete transcript. No one ever says, nah, she didn't do this or anything like that.
And importantly, if someone did say it, it would be on there because it records the entire answers of the inquest.
Right. Although, I have to admit, everyone who reads this inquest has to admit the questions are loaded.
Right.
Because they're never asked point blank. So-and-so said this in, let's say, Toledo. You were there too. Did you see the same thing or did you see something different? No, the questions are always just simply tell us what you saw.
Right. Wait, sorry. They're not, the questions aren't loaded, right?
No, the questions are not,
they're not prompting you to get.
Yeah, they're not prompting you.
Right.
One way or the other. They're just simply saying, tell us what you saw. This is the way that things get pieced together then, because you might have someone from this location tell you this is what they saw. And they mention several things. But you might have someone in that very same location who refers to these very same things, but adds others. But there's no one that I know of, in the case of Teresa, who says, "No, she was a fake," or, that didn't happen. You might have a difference because eyewitness accounts are always different concerning the height of the levitation or the frequency of the levitation.
And they could be genuinely different eyewitnesses, right?
Right.
Right.
Meaning
that they could have witnessed different acts of levitation from one saint.
And they might have seen it from different perspective. Or they might not be remembering the same thing. I mean, it happens to me, happens to every human being. Our memories are not foolproof. Two people can see the same event and remember it differently.
So let me summarize the argument for the case that the evidence is actually quite strong. And the case is this. And this is also why I like levitation, because when you talk about visions or stigmata or mass psychosis, like you can all have psychological explanations for that, but levitation really is and so here's the thing. You have an event that's difficult to confuse, levitation, often performed with large audiences in sometimes spaces, like outdoor spaces, that are almost impossible with the technology of the day to fake levitation. And then you send out pretty rigorous cross-examination, that all the inquests, that all comes back, in the case of St. Teresa, positive. And we know that when when there are frauds, people are open to speak up about it. And then we have the hagiographies that sometimes process these inquests. But sometimes we do have access to the inquests themselves. So that is the case for the evidence being strong, effectively.
Yes. And in the case of the 21st century individual who dedicated his life to Joseph of Cupertino, but a very, very complete biography that includes constant references to the Inquisition, to the
inquests.
The inquest, yeah.
So let's do an exercise of counterfactual history. Let's say neither St. Teresa nor St. Joseph flew. What's the best explanation for what we were witnessing in terms of the testimony?
Well,
what do your critics say?
My critics say simply they're lying.
Right.
They're lies. You can't believe them. So they're all lying. And their reasons for lying are obvious. They want people to believe this stuff that they themselves know didn't happen.
Right.
Which I find to be a very questionable assumption.
Yeah. I mean, that would almost be more miraculous, right? More than the actual levitation.
I would say, there's a chance, but statistically, I think it's a very small percentage of a chance that this would happen. There's also the mass hallucination, or individual hallucination, and also mass hallucination.
But that's why I like levitation. I don't think it's something you can hallucinate yourself into really perceiving.
It is hard. Bilocation, that has a higher probability of some kind of hallucination. You see someone. But, I'm going to cite miracle that falls into that other category you just brought up of visions. It's the most extreme case of mass hallucinations I have run into. And not very many people know about it because it's a very odd event. From 1968 to 1971, in a suburb of Cairo, Egypt, over 1 million people claimed to have repeatedly seen the Virgin Mary at this one church. I'm just reading a book on it now that just came out last month that has all of this testimony. Most of it from Muslims, not from Christians. Because Mary has a special place. I mean,
in Islamic culture as well.
Right.
Yes. Right.
Jesus is not divine,
right? But he's a messenger.
He's a messenger, he's a prophet, and the mother is very, very special. So, there are all sorts of scientific explanations for these mass hallucinations, including one that I had never run into before, which is tectonic. tectonic forces, right? Where there's earthquake and the magnetic resonance or something magnetic gets altered by the earthquake and creates lights, and people see these things. That's one of the attempts to explain away this. But levitation, it's just, things don't match up. That's what it is. Things just don't match up between the testimony and either mass hallucination, personal hallucination, or total 100% lying.
Right. So what is the best counterfactual history? Let's assume that neither of these saints levitated. What is the most plausible explanation for how we get all this testimony in your mind?
My mind is just lying, which to
is
me
not that plausible,
is a problem. Right? It's problematic.
Right.
I find it very problematic that all of this is lying. And, the possibility of creating, let's say, an oral culture. Nothing is written down, but people suggest to each other, let's lie. So there's no smoking gun. Mm-hmm. You can't find documents, letters, people writing to each other saying, let's lie about Joseph Cupertino.
Right.
So it has to be oral. I don't know. I just find that improbable.
Right. So at the very least, I think your book either raises the reality of levitation, or it raises an equally interesting question, which is how, in the absence of levitation, could all this testimony come to be, right? So at the very least, there's something extremely interesting here.
Yes. How do you explain all these testimonies?
Right.
Can they all be lies? It's improbable.
So let's zoom out a bit from just levitation, because reading your book literally ended up in me witnessing what I think to be now a miracle. So when I was reading your book, one of my Orthodox friends, just very casually out of the blue, as if he was just telling me about visiting a McDonald's or something, just told me, oh yeah, I've seen a miracle before. And it's this icon, which for our audience back home is this wooden carved image of Mother Mary in an Orthodox church that exuded oil indefinitely. It just keep dropping oil. And I did a mini pilgrimage last week to this Orthodox church in Taylor, Pennsylvania to see it. And there was a whole service built around it on Wednesdays and Sundays. We went on the Wednesday one, and you go into the church. And at first I was super skeptical. I was like, oh, I'm just going to see small oil smudges on the surface of the icon. But then the father, the priest, took out the icon from the case that was enclosed and went around the room dropping the oil on all of our hands. And so the frequency which it dropped, it's about yay big, was like drip, drip, drip. So it wasn't pouring out, but it wasn't just the like small speckles I was expecting to see. And that went on for about 10 minutes. And me and my friends who I went were so shocked. We had no idea what to believe in, because for me personally, I'm very open to these things. And I would say I'm a religious seeker, but even one of my Protestant friends who saw this miracle was extremely shocked. And so your book really helped me process what I was witnessing, because the first thing that came to my mind was, this is fraud. This is fraudulent, right? But now I don't think it was fraudulent, because there's a few of these mirror producing, like infinite oil generating icons in the world. And for it to be fraudulent, for something of that magnitude to be faked for 10 or 20 years, I think it would require most, if not all, of the clergy within a parish to be in on it. And that violates my understanding of psychology more than a miracle would violate my understanding of metaphysics. And so I guess where this brings me to, because I'm still in shock still after a week, I kind of feel like one of the people you described in your book, so this was a Protestant prince, a Protestant duke, who witnessed a Catholic miracle. And he said, woe to the day that I stepped foot on this wretched soil, because before my world was secure, I understood what was going on. But now my entire worldview is out the window.
Yeah, and this prince was basically saying, I have no choice now.
Right.
No choice but to, abandon my family's religion and become Catholic. But however, there's always you can't have belief without doubt. You can't have any kind of belief without some measure of suspicion when it comes to a miracle.
Yeah.
Seeing something like a weeping icon, it depends. The one you describe is extreme.
Right.
I once saw a weeping icon in Chicago, but it was only weeping tears from one eye.
And you saw the
I saw it was like a very slow stream, but I don't remember it dripping out like you described. But yeah, dripping icons, dripping corpses of saints are also, no, I wouldn't say they're common,
right,
but they have occurred throughout certainly the Middle Ages into the present day.
Right, I see. And so I wanted to double click on what you were saying about suspicion, because there's still, I'm pretty sure it's not fraud, but there's still a suspicion that maybe it's fraud. So I think it would be helpful if you gave us an overview of the history of fraudulence, especially in Christian miracles, because the history of miracles is at once and the same history of many frauds, right?
Sure. Miracles have always been faked, especially the farther back you go in time. There is a very fuzzy line between magic as what magic is supposed to be, some special control of nature, and magic as we call magicians or illusionists on stage, right? And that's always been a very fuzzy line. I've seen many illusionists, including David Blaine, levitate, right? And they do it. They also make things disappear and so on and so forth. Actually, we have some second century Christian texts, especially one, the Acts of Peter, where Peter is actually competing with this magician, Simon Magus. Simon is tricking people into thinking that he has control over nature, or maybe even more than that, claiming that he has special powers. And Peter has his miracles and Simon has his miracles. The early Christian world was filled with magi, magicians. So this fakery from the Christian side, of course, it's a charge that you level against the person who's on the wrong side. Well, your stuff is trickery. Icons that weep, especially in the 16th century, wherever Protestants took over, and they found one of these icons, they would immediately tear it apart to see what kind of devices might be behind it. Whether it was a three-dimensional image or a two-dimensional image. They were always looking for the trickery.
Right.
And of course, they write extensively about any trickery they find.
Right. So there's a very well documented tradition of sort of this. But there's one specific example that you bring out in the book. I believe the pronunciation is Magdalena.
Yes, Magdalena de la Cruz, who fooled everyone into thinking that she was a very holy woman, and actually had a bevy of acolytes or servers within her convent who helped her carry out this ruse. Magdalena's problem was that, well, for one thing, she began to make extreme claims, not just the stigmata, but inadia, being able to survive without eating or eating very, very little. And she also made the mistake of playing favorites within the convent. And that's eventually what undid her, was the fact that the nuns who were not in her little bevy were being treated.
Whistleblowers, right?
Yeah, they became whistleblowers.
Right.
And called attention to her, and she was unmasked.
And that's why, again, I find the phenomenon that I witnessed to probably be of supernatural in origin, because first of all, to fake that, I think, would be much more difficult than faking just one stream, right? You'd have to have, for 10 minutes, you'd have to have some kind of pressure device that exuded oil out, and you can do this. But what it would require is that it would require the majority of the parish. This is the part where I find to be very difficult. The majority of the parish to be in on it for decades with no whistleblowers. And so, to going back to one of the things you said about how the icon you saw was very subtle, the one I saw was just exuding oil, and to the point where there was a puddle on the floor, on the carpet. And they said there was one time we just couldn't control her. Those were the exact words they used. We couldn't contain her. And they also said that this icon changed its flow of oil depending on the Christian calendar. Like before Easter, it would go dry, and then on Easter, it would accelerate, and that it even accelerated during the beginning of the Ukraine war. And so it would be responsive to the world in these ways. And so, again, it's because, now we obviously have been discussing the cases of fraud, and in your books, there's many other cases you bring up that we don't think are fraud, right? But I just wanted to start with fraud, because I think that's the first thing anyone, especially in our secular world, will go to. And this is something that you've considered in your book, but more importantly, what balances out the cases of fraud, and I was extremely surprised to learn this, is that it seems like the Catholic Church is almost even more intent on weeding out false miracles than the secularists, the atheists are. So to tell us about that history, this counter history of, given the fraud, of how the Catholic Church and why they were so eager on weeding out the false miracles.
Yes. Throughout the Middle Ages, the Church was interested in weeding out frauds. But it's in the 16th century that it really begins to implement a more rational type of investigation into all miracle accounts. This is the age of the Renaissance and the beginning of the age of reason. And it spills over into the church. The church is always very, very much part of the greater culture. So beginning in the 16th century, it actually inserts doubt into the process of verifying miracle claims. And how do they do it? Well, they do it in various ways. One of them is by streamlining and regularizing the canonization process for anyone who's holy and up for sainthood. They prepare questionnaires, 2 sets of questionnaires. The first is for the first level to be called blessed, beatification. It's one inquest. Once someone is named blessed, then comes the second inquest for canonization.
Sainthood.
And for sainthood, and the questionnaires go out. And individuals who are answering these questions have to swear. Pretty much as in American courts, people have to swear to be telling the truth and nothing but the truth.
Right.
Except the penalty involved in lying is hell.
Right.
Eternal punishment. Or if they actually express regret over having committed the sin, they might end up in purgatory.
Right.
But it's real suffering. It's not like light. It's not like Coke Light or Pepsi Light. There's no like hell light. So anyway, the inquest has the questionnaire has a whole section on miracles, and people swear that they have seen this happen. X, Y, Z, whatever this is. They swear that they saw it happen, and they can sometimes go into details, not just, yes, I saw it happen, but this is what happened. And then they give you all these details about the event. And more than that, an official is made part of the process, who in popular terms is known as the devil's advocate.
Right.
And that name reveals a lot about this position, is that it's the job of this man to ask really hard questions and dig as deeply as possible into the possibility of fraud. And then later in the 18th century, a cardinal who had been serving as the devil's advocate, Prospero Lambertini, becomes pope. And he writes the set of books that is still used to this day in the canonization process. And the CBS show 60 Minutes, many, many, many years ago, had a show 60 Minutes at the Vatican. And I remember this very clearly. The man in charge of the canonization process happened to be an American. And he said, you know what I look for? I look for atheist doctors and scientists. That's who I want investigating these miracles. And in the case of canonization today, it's really very, very, very focused on healing miracles rather than miracles like levitation and bilocation. It's healing miracles because those are the ones that atheist scientists can say, science or medicine has no way of explaining how this tumor just disappeared. Or in the case of one where I got to read the original documents, which took place here in the United States and was for the canonization of Elizabeth Drexel. A girl had been born without any nerves in her ears. And after praying to Catherine Drexel, her parents did, all of a sudden, nerves developed. And I read the testimony from the doctors. No, this is impossible. This doesn't happen. You know, you don't just generate nerves at, like, I think she was 5 or 6 when this happened.
Right.
This just simply does not happen.
Right, I see. One thing I want to emphasize for our listeners, because I don't want them to have a too nice and self-serving view of these canonization inquests. Because the fear is, you know, it's just a bunch of self-serving religious people,
That's right.
Asking. This is like KGB or like CIA is like, or like the Gestapo is a better analogy almost for the type of just rigorous grilling and the type of punishment that awaits people who sort of disobey this. People who are not even charged of fraudulence, being locked up in cells, right? Like, and being grilled and having everyone grilled. This really is a serious cross-examination. This isn't just some child's play asking these kind of self-serving questions between religious folk to emphasize their own spirituality.
And they have to be very, very careful wherever this is happening, whether it's Italy or Spain. Let me back up just a second. Italy and Spain, we're talking about places that are basically 100% Catholic. And they have these institutions that work well, like well-oiled machinery. In other places in Europe where, well, for different reasons, in different places, you end up with a mixture of Protestants and Catholics. And sometimes within one place, like for instance, many cities in the Netherlands, you actually have mixed populations of Catholics and Protestants. It's much harder to set up this kind of system. So in Italy and Spain, you have clergy whose job it is to discover fraud. I mean, that's what they're tasked with.
Right.
And they set about doing so. And, you know, an example of someone who was canonized, Teresa of Avila. She kept being denounced to the Spanish Inquisition as a heretic and a fraud until she was beatified. Only then did the accusations cease, right? Did the Inquisition act on those accusations after a certain point? Well, after a certain point, apparently when it was getting close to her beatification, they received these denunciations and filed them. They kept them in their files, but they didn't act on it because they were already convinced that she was the genuine article.
Right. And so that's one thing I just wanted to emphasize, that this really is trustworthy in a way because of the rigor of the cross-examination here. But I wanted to push back on one of the things you said. You said that people who were asked these questions about them witnessing these miracles did so by swearing essentially their soul, right? Like, I swear on my soul, and the punishment for believing Catholic would be at least purgatory, if not hell. However, in your book, you did mention someone, I believe Maria is her name, where under interrogation, she confessed that what she said, swearing under oath a few decades before, was not exactly true because she was being pressured by her superiors.
She was being pressured,
right?
And she was scared.
Right. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, this is not the sort of foolproof kind of guarantee right.
It's not foolproof guarantee, but in her case, that's Maria de Agreda, who lived in the 17th century, later than Teresa of Avila. In her case, she is being grilled about the experiences that she is having.
Right.
She was being grilled about her bilocations from Spain to present-day Texas and New Mexico. We're talking about thousands of miles of difference. Bilocation is being in two places at the same time, but only being functional at one of those two places.
Right.
Because the individual goes into mystical ecstasy in place A and then appears in place B.
Right.
So only place B is this person able to do things and communicate. At place A, they are in a cataleptic state, completely body frozen, rigid, and no sensation whatsoever. And they get pricked with needles, put candles up to their eyes, no response. So she was being asked very precise technical questions about how she got there. And it was being suggested to her, for instance, did angels carry you? Or was there some other way that you got there? And she answered, at one point, she answered yes to the angels, I think.
Right.
And then, but years later, when grilled again, she said, well, I was very young. She also does add this. I was very young, and I was very intimidated by these men who were questioning me. So they pressed me on this point, and I said yes.
Right.
To one of their loaded questions, I said yes. So I take it back. I'm not scared anymore.
Right.
I take it back. Yes, people can lie, but I think it's the sheer number of testimonies in a canonization inquest, sheer number of testimonies taken from not only different types of people, but from different locations.
Right.
Who say things that match each other. This is what I have said to some critics of my argument, is that the sheer number of people who say this happened and then give you details is so large that it is more difficult to conceive of that many, as you said before, that many people lying.
Right.
And telling the same lie.
The psychology would be more of a violation than metaphysics.
Yeah. In no other case do historians run into a high number of testimonies and then discard them offhand completely as lies.
Right. And when you say they share the same level of details, let's take levitation for an example. What kind of details are you suggesting that they're shared that would be very difficult to explain why all these different people would say this? Because, levitation was in the air in the time, right? Like, people were told of it. So if it was just about a person flying, then that wouldn't be a detail worth discussing. But was it the way they were flying that corroborated each other? Or tell us about that. Yeah.
Well, here's an extreme example, but I think because it is extreme, it actually shows the significance of details, of description of a phenomenon in two completely different circumstances, with the details being identical.
Please, yes.
So, Saint Teresa of Avila didn't like levitating. She begged God, please stop it.
Right.
You know?
Why?
Well, because this is calling attention to me,
Right.
and I'm being investigated. And what purpose does it serve other than to get me into trouble? So she tried to resist these. She said it was like a mighty force that came up beneath her that just pushed her up. She tried to resist, and she said afterwards, if I resisted, my body would hurt for days, just simply for resisting. So she asked her nuns, she was their superior, you see me going up, please try to hold me down, right? Try to hold me down. And if I do go up, try to pull me down. And they're unable to stop the phenomenon. And this is in the 50s, 1693, Boston. Not nuns, but Puritans, Protestants, in 1693 Boston, are trying to heal a teenage girl who is possessed by the devil. Protestants reject much of Catholic theology, but they don't reject Catholic demonology.
Right.
But what I find is remarkable in comparing these two cases is that the man who's leading this exorcism is Cotton Mather, a very, very well-known and well-respected Puritan cleric who actually took part in the Salem witch trials. And Cotton Mather brings several other men into the room where this girl is lying on a bed. And she starts to go up from the bed. And Mather gets all these men to pile up on top of this girl to prevent her from going up. And up she goes. And then she's up against the roof, and they try to pull her down, and they can't. And then afterwards, Cotton Mather makes these men sign affidavits. Again, this sounds like very similar to Catholic canonization inquest. These men sign these documents saying, we saw this happen. Now, I find it so unlikely. I put it in the 99.9% probability that Cotton Mather and these Puritans had never read the canonization inquest for Teresa, where the previous story I mentioned it appears.
Right.
For one thing, in 1693, those documents were still only in manuscript. They had not been published. So what are these men in Boston doing? Has one of them traveled to Rome to search in the Vatican archives for the canonization? No, of course not.
What you're trying to show here is that it's not from a similar story that they got this specific detail about not being able to pull them down.
Yes.
You're trying to argue that this, even if it was made up, they independently, for some reason, made the same story up. Right. And so I see. And what I think would add even more comfort to our secular audience who is listening is that science and scientists with empirical scientific methods were actually often invited into these canonization processes, right? So tell us about how the Catholic Church loops in secular atheist scientists into this process.
Well, I suppose it varies from case to case how they get atheists to cooperate with this process, but they do manage somehow to do this, beginning especially from the late 16th century on. And, it gets ever more streamlined in the 17th and then in the 18th under Prospero Lambertini, even more so. But they always somehow manage to get skeptics, real skeptics. And of course, the closer you get to our time, the easier it is to find skeptics.
Right.
So the sheer number of skeptics that are out there, I think, helps to explain why in the 20th century, that one case I read was from the late 20th century.
The nerve growing in the ears.
The nerve growing in the ears, right?
Right.
And yes, total skeptics who are physicians are saying modern medicine cannot explain how this happened. As far as we know, this never happens.
Right. I actually disagree with the weighting that you attributed between healing miracles and the other miracles. To me, biology is a lot more mysterious, and there might be a lot more processes that we don't know how it operates.
Right.
Whereas if I see someone levitate, and I check to make sure there's no wires everywhere,
Right.
I'm kind of just in shock. So have there been anything like that where physics can't explain, but you bring in a skeptical scientist and they come out?
Here's the everything in the Catholic Church is full of details that might seem small to an outside observer, but they really play a major role in it. And the reason that there's a focus on healing miracles is because these are post-mortem miracles. You can divide miracles into miracles that occurred during the person's lifetime and miracles after death. And what canonization is trying to prove is that this person is now in heaven and can hear prayers and intercede with God to perform miracles. And people usually don't ask for saintly intercession for anything other than healings. Saint Teresa, please make it so that ask God to give a vocation to my daughter so she can enter a convent, become a mystic, and levitate. Nobody makes those requests. However, in the inquest, yes, those events, levitation, bilocation, any other miracle performed by the saint, are investigated. But what the inquest is focused on for proof of this person being in heaven are post-mortem miracles.
Right.
And actually, Prospero Lambertini also is instrumental in making heroic virtue the chief characteristic of sainthood.
Right. Rather than miracles.
Rather than miracles, yeah.
Right.
If somebody's been performing miracles, supposedly, but did not display heroic virtue, or might have actually displayed the sin of pride, for instance, no, they're not going to make it.
Right. And to emphasize to our listeners, during this process where the Catholic Church or the Inquisition is suspicious of you, one of the big things they do to determine whether your miracle was of human, fraudulent, divine, or demonic origin is your character.
Yes.
Right? Like, are you a humble person? Are you a proud person? Are you bossing people around like Magdalena was?
Yeah.
And however, there are other types of post-mortem miracles that also lend to potential scientific analysis. One of them is bodies not decomposing, or as you mentioned, bodies oozing out oil, like the icon. So can you share a few examples of that scientists have just are unable to explain?
Well, Teresa of Avila's corpse refused to decompose and was investigated by doctors of that day. And then again in the 19th century was dug up again, investigated by members of the medical school of the University of Salamanca, professors, still incorrupt. They ran whatever scientific tests they were able to run on the remains. And now, 4 or 5 weeks ago, she's been dug up again.
Poor saints.
This is one of the downsides of becoming a saint. You get no rest, or your corpse gets no rest. And they're running whatever tests are available now that were not available in the late 19th century.
Right.
And one of the characteristics of Teresa's body is that she used oil. I'm not too clear on this detail if it had stopped by the 19th century or not. But when it was flowing copiously, smelled wonderful, and performed healing miracles. And then a colleague of mine, Craig Harleen, who's also a historian, is currently researching a nun in the Low Countries, 17th century, who also oozed a lot of oil. His description that he has read to me of what was going on. It's like the quantities that you witnessed, that kind of,
Right.
they would fill bottles with her oil.
Right.
So the technical term for any such oozer is myroblight. And there are many throughout history. When I say many, I said relative. Many, because you don't...
Relative to what we expect.
Yes.
What about things like the icon that I witness? Have anything like that been tested by scientists? Because, I mean, we can just design the easiest experiment. We can do it in this room, right? We set up cameras, we pat the thing dry, we just let it flow in front of a webcam for a few weeks. And I mean, this was the most suspicious thing out of everything that I witnessed there, of why I'm still somewhat not fully convinced.
You know, investigating something like that, perfect example that comes to mind, it's not oozing, but it's the Shroud of Turin, which supposedly was the covering on Jesus's corpse right after the crucifixion, which is in Turin, Italy. And how it got there, no one knows for sure, but Crusaders had something to do with bringing it from the Near East. How they got it, we don't know. Anyway, 2 decades ago, I believe it was, maybe even longer ago than that, they ran tests on it. And the tests showed that this object had to be from the 13th century because of the fabric employed. But they took tiny little cuts out of it to do this.
So it wasn't the original.
So they said some decades ago. Now they're working on it again. And the latest research with up-to-date scientific equipment has shown that no, the fabric from this other part of the shroud from which they took the sample is 1st century. And more than that the blood stains on this are human blood. And more than that, there's an element or a substance in the blood that only appears in the blood when someone has undergone major physical trauma. So now scientists, which scientists do you believe?
Right.
Again, this doubt thing is there. And actually a story came to mind, personal story, someone I know, that proves how impossible it is to convince skeptics 100% of the time that these things are real. One of my brother's best friends was injured in Vietnam. He was a Marine, and somebody threw a grenade at his Jeep and it flipped over and he injured his leg and had been struggling with that injured leg ever since. Somehow he ends up at Lourdes, the shrine in southern France, where supposedly there's this water in this grotto. Through an apparition of the Virgin Mary in the 19th century, this became a center for healing. My friend was reluctant. He didn't want to go to Lourdes, but whoever he was traveling with said, no, I want to go there, you come along. Anyway, when he goes to the grotto, he stumbles and puts his hand against the wall of the grotto to steady himself. And he was cured. But he refuses to.
He himself refuses to
Yes,
believe.
he refuses to believe that was a miracle. And I had this one long conversation phone conversation, about 2 hours long, maybe longer than that, where he kept explaining what sort of physical thing might have been at work in his leg healing.
Right.
So,
but this is why I'm a bit frustrated that there's not been more testing around done on the icon, because all the examples you brought up today, right? I could conceive of some kind of natural process.
Yeah.
You know, the leg takes time to heal. The shroud is from another, poor, Roman legionnaire. But if we just wiped this icon and it just dripped oil, not even for a year, for a few months,
yes,
that's something coming out of nothing, right? That is a metaphysical kind of impossibility. That's so strong. It's not just biological. Have you seen anyone try to test an object like this? Because to me, this is just not something you can ignore, right?
Not to my knowledge, but that doesn't mean that there hasn't been.
Right.
I just have not looked at objects,
right?
Especially these weeping icons,
right?
Because there are also bleeding hosts. The bread that supposedly turns into, like in Catholic belief,
the Eucharist.
They don't say supposedly. It turns into the body of Christ. There have been bleeding hosts, hundreds of them,
right,
throughout history. And also there are vials of the blood of saints that are believed to liquefy on their feast day. Or in particular, as you were saying of this icon, it's keyed to certain calendars.
Calendar,
yes,
right?
It responds to the calendar, yeah. So that's a whole other area of miracles I have not worked with.
Have you come across any fraudulence when it comes to these weeping statues or icons or mechanisms that...
Protestant histories are full of them. As a matter of fact, they delight in unmasking these frauds.
They're the theists. They're the atheists of the
time. No, yes, that's a good way of putting it. They are totally skeptical about objects that do things that objects are not supposed to do.
Right.
And they're also very keen on unmasking another type of fraud, which is, a false relic, claiming that this bone here was from so-and-so.
One of the funniest examples you had in one of your other books is that at one time there were 7 heads of John the Baptist being claimed, right?
Yes, and there were also slivers from the true cross of Christ. So many, in fact, that there was a joke going around that, I've read more than one author tell the same joke, and I can't tell who came up with it, that although only one man carried the cross, nowadays, 16th century, if you put them together, you could build a ship.
Right.
So...
well, frankly, I'm actually surprised by how willing Christians, not just the Catholics, but the Orthodox as well, are to subject these objects to testing. Because one could totally see that as being impious in someone, right? Because even in the Bible, you almost get the sense that miracles for Christ are kind of secondary or tertiary. Like he's almost kind of annoyed that he has to do these things to get you to listen to him, right? This is not the key part of his message. And so testing these icons scientifically, testing the body, redigging up the bodies of the saints, is there not worry of being impious, that you're almost testing God?
There's that element to it, but it's acknowledged that there's a need to do this, given the climate of skepticism that was in place in the 16th century, from the 16th century to now. The Protestant Reformation played a very significant role in creating skepticism about these events. And, one of the founders of social science, Max Weber, argued way over 100 years ago that the Protestant Reformation had taken magic out of the world, usually translated as disenchanted the world. But the word he used, the German word he used, Entzauberung, Zauber is magic in German. So what he really says, Protestantism took the magic out of the world. And to a certain extent, he is correct. Although Protestants were on a spectrum of sorts as to, what they were willing to accept or believe. For instance, Martin Luther continued to believe that Jesus Christ was really present in the bread and the wine. But other Protestant reformers from Switzerland, or southern Germany, refused to believe this. And they had a meeting where they came together and discussed this at length. And they couldn't agree. And they went their separate ways. They were actually getting together at that meeting so they could form a military alliance to protect themselves against the Holy Roman Emperor, who was Catholic. And even that did not
enough.
force them to agree on this point. So, yeah, belief is a funny thing.
Right. And I now want to move the conversation along and talk about something you've only hinted at, which is the demonic. Because to say that a miracle or a supposed miracle is not human fraud was only half the battle, if that, in this early modern period. Because if it was supernatural, it could be caused either by the devil or by God, divine. So tell us about the devil and how he created miracles.
Well, there was a very important, again, one of these tiny distinctions. It seems tiny, but it's not. The devil has no supernatural powers because the devil is a creature. He's a fallen angel. He was created by God. Only God fully controls nature and is above nature and can do whatever he wants with nature. Gradually, this demonology develops in the Middle Ages, which the devil is credited with having preternatural powers. What does that mean? It means that he is like a good scientist. His intellect is so incredibly ancient. He has been around for so long, and he is so incredibly smart that he is like a good scientist. He knows how to manipulate nature rather than upend or transcend, that's a better word, transcend the laws of nature.
So it's technology rather than magic.
In his case, yes. Yeah, and there's a Spanish proverb that says the devil is so smart because he's so old. He's been around for so long that he knows how things work. And he can manipulate things, and actually he's very good at fooling people into thinking that what he's doing is divine.
Right. So that's what's really tricky about this. It was believed that the devil constantly disguises himself as Christ or as working from Christ.
Yes.
And what makes this all the more troubling, and I think this is what you were getting at with your Weber point, why he's only half right, is that the Protestants got rid of the divine magic from the world, but it opened it up to the demonic magic.
Yes.
Because their belief is, correct me if I'm wrong, that miracles, the ones from God, stopped after the apostles went away. Because the purpose of the miracles were to reveal the legitimacy of God's messengers, which are the apostles. And so every Catholic miracle since, let's say, the first century, the Protestants thought to be secretly by the devil himself.
Yes. If they weren't frauds, they were demonic.
Right. So you almost prefer to be a fraud to the Protestant.
Yeah, well, in that case, yeah. But the thing is, as many of the Protestant reformers put it, the greatest miracle of all is that people became Christian without miracles after the year 100. But you have to think what the polemical value of this argument is. Because from the very start, when Protestantism emerges, Catholics are saying to the Protestant leaders, where are your miracles? Look at all the miracles we have.
Right.
So they could say, well, sure, you have them, but of course, you're the false church. So it has to be the devil. And so it went. Until to this day, there are still Protestant churches that still believe this. Most of the mainline churches just gave up on this stuff in the 20th century. But fact is, the devil can manipulate nature and also appear in disguise. Two stories, for instance. One is Teresa of Avila. She's getting visits from Jesus Christ. She has visions of Christ, and they actually exchange dialogue. And then she has to confess all this to her confessor. And she does, and several confessors tell her, that's not Christ. That's the devil.
Right. And these are the Catholics. So even within the Catholics, this is the intuition.
Yeah.
Right.
Her confessors are saying, this is the devil. So one of them says to her, the next time Jesus shows up, give him the fig, which is the equivalent of our middle finger nowadays. I hope nobody's offended in the 21st century.
I don't think anyone in the 17th century is watching this. I think we're good.
So she does. And according to her, Jesus' response was, thank you. Thank you for obeying your confessor. But now go tell him I'm not the devil. And it wasn't until she found a confessor who was younger than her, a Jesuit, a member of the Jesuit order, who said, no, that is Christ. Stop doubting it.
Stop giving Christ the finger.
Yes, yeah. So that's one story. So the other is Martin Luther, who relates that one time when he was hiding, right after he was proclaimed an outlaw of the empire, his prince hid Luther away in a castle. And that's where he translated the New Testament into German. And he was doing this. He says, one day I came into my room, which was very high up. This castle was built on a cliff. He said, I came in and there was a black dog on my bed I had never seen before. So I did the only thing I could do. I threw it out the window. And then he ran down to see if he could find the dead dog. There was no dog down there. So he knew that he was right. And he had done the right thing because that black dog was the devil.
Right.
So what do you do with these, stories?
And I can't emphasize how prevalent the devil is for especially the Protestant mind in this time. And I'll quote you what I think is the funniest quote from your book. Luther's devil was no mere theological concept. He was a very real fiend who was constantly acting in the world and had to be warded off, preferably with as much crudeness as possible, because Luther was convinced that the evil one should be attacked with his own weapons. This is Luther. The devil seeks me out when I am at home in bed, he said, and I always have one or two devils waiting to pounce on me. They are smart devils. If they can't overwhelm my heart, they grab my head and plague me there. And when that proves useless, I show them my ass, for that's where they belong. Taunts such as lick my ass and eat my shit were hurled at the devil by Luther with abandon. Flatulence topped all this scatology, much like frosting in some cake from hell. Once after farting loudly, he said, "Take this, devil, here's a crow's ear for you. Go to Rome and give it to your idol, the Pope." And whenever his conscience was troubled by particular sins, he would say, "Hey, devil, I just shit in my pants too. Have you added that to your list of sins yet?"
That's Luther.
Was the devil always so prevalent for the Christian mind?
From very early on, yes.
As prevalent as that example?
Yes. This is what many people in the 21st century don't realize, even people who are Christian, is how ever-present the devil was to Christians from the first century on.
Right. Until maybe in the last 100 or 200 years. Because now the devil has retreated into, I don't know, it's just your psychology or...
Right. The devil as metaphor.
Right.
For evil.
Right. And we are the anomaly, not Luther, in terms of the history of thinking about the devil. Early Christian monastics, the stories of their battles with devils are epic. E-P-I-C. Epic. The world was infested with demonic presences. And actually we have this testimony from a Roman emperor, Julian the Apostate, 4th century. Why is he known as the Apostate? Well, because he was baptized. It's one of the very first, right after Constantine, one of the very first Christian emperors who abandoned his Christian faith. But he had this to say in one text, and I can't remember which text, but he said, you can always tell who the Christians are because they are always making the sign of the cross and hissing at demons. And he didn't mean it as a compliment. Right.
He said, look at these Christians. They're all...
thinking about crazy stuff and
And, modern day, 21st century, late 20th century thinking by Christians on the devil is really on a spectrum, from those that still consider it very real to those that just say this is just a work of the imagination.
But the dominant trend really has been to this latter one. At least, I'm a Girard scholar who's this Catholic thinker and philosopher, and he thinks about Satan as almost like a social historical mechanism that persecutes innocents. And so But that is the anomaly I have to emphasize to our audience.
Historically, yes. Yeah.
And what I found really surprising, just to give another example of how important the devil was for intellectual thought at the time. People do attribute belief of the devil to the beginning of the witch hunts. But the crazy thing I learned from your book was that it was also one of the reasons probably that the witch hunts were ended. So let me give you a quote. Ironically, such intense belief in the devil's power to deceive probably played a large role in bringing the witch hunts to an end, out of fear that perhaps too many of those accused of witchcraft could be innocent folk falsely accused by witnesses in the grip of the devil's wishes. This was Mather's ultimate argument. If one cannot trust the devil, especially because he loves mayhem and finds it so easy to deceive humans, then why trust the testimony of those who denounce witches? No devil, no witch hunts. A little belief in the devil, witch hunts. Extreme belief in the devil, no witch hunts again. What this made me realize was that it made me a lot more sympathetic to Descartes' thinking in his famous Meditations, because I was always unmoved by his famous questioning, which is, how do I know that I'm not being tricked by an evil genius, an evil demon? But now, understanding the historical background, this was the default assumption of your epistemic worldview.
Yes. The devil could not just manipulate nature, but precisely could get literally inside your head, or even worse, your whole body, possess you. But there's these technical distinctions. Possession is when the devil takes over you completely. Obsession is when the devil gets in your thoughts and you obsess about things. As in the case of Luther, what did he obsess about? He obsessed about his sins that he had committed and obsessed about the fact that he had sinned so much that God could never forgive him. That's why he's telling the devil, go chew on my pants that I just soiled. Don't tell me that, to obsess about my sins. So, convincing people of something was within his powers, and people believed this.
Right.
But, during the Enlightenment is when this all begins to unravel in the West. And Voltaire, for instance, the quote is, if God did not exist, we would have to invent him. What Voltaire really meant was that the only way to get people to be ethical was by inventing a God who punishes. So in a way, Voltaire has done away with the devil. He's also done away with God. But it says that God who punishes evil is necessary. And then there's another quote, I don't have it verbatim, but he says basically, there isn't a single mayor or governor or any political figure who hasn't found it necessary to frighten the hell out of people, to get them to behave, and to even say, there's a devil.
Right. I think it was some historian commenting on Rome saying the people find the different religions equally true, the philosophers equally false, and the politicians equally useful.
Yes.
Right. So last question on the demonic. How can we be sure? Because the danger is so fundamental epistemically that it can be literally tricking our thoughts. How can one be sure that the miracles that we describe today, that pass this scientific scrutiny, like the saints, or even the icon that I witness, is from a benevolent and not a malevolent source?
Well, traditionally there's been a line of distinction, line drawn, which is a distinction that allows miracles attributed to a saint to be divine rather than demonic, and that is the saint's behavior, which is why the heroic virtue bit is so important. And Lambertini makes it even more important, because if you're leading the wrong kind of life, all your miracles become suspect. If you're leading the right kind of life, well, that's the ultimate proof.
Right, I see. So the devil can trick you in any moment, but it's hard for him to fake, or it would be unbecoming of the devil's intentions to actually make someone saintly or something like that.
Yes, no, yeah. The devil hates God so much, and he hates humans so much. What he loves to do is to create enmity between God and humans and God.
And what is the Protestant rebuttal of that? When you look at a very pious saint who does miracles, do they still claim it's from the demon?
They have trouble with this in the polemical dimension. You're right. It's a very, very good question. In the polemical dimension, what do Protestants do with the behavior of the saints?
Right.
Yeah, they have. I have yet to see any Protestant text that dwells on this subject. They say, yeah, the miracles are all, demonic. But, this heroic virtue, what they do say is that quite often what Catholics deem heroic virtue is totally wrong theologically. Because what do they consider heroic virtue above everything else? The monastic vows, the monastic virtues. Poverty, chastity, obedience, temperance. Well, they have trouble then, see, when they cross the line into virtues that were also praised by ancient pagans.
Right.
Such as fortitude, temperance, and so on. They just happened to pull it off.
Right.
They pulled it off, but that doesn't mean that miracles surrounding their lives are.
What about miracles that are unrelated to a person, like the icon, for example?
Yeah, that's where Protestants would say that's definitely, there's no connection to.
Right.
And so it's either fraud or it's
the devil.
The devil.
What about the Catholics? Do they want to test those objects that are unrelated to people as well, or?
They don't get tested the same way, but definitely the people associated with these objects, because there are always people associated with them. They're custodians, right? They had better stay on the straight and narrow and lead good lives, good holy lives, or else there's their misbehavior puts the miraculous image in a bad light.
I see.
Although there are always exceptions. See, this is the tricky thing about religion. Can be so slippery. And that's one of the differences between philosophy and religion, is that religion has, every subject it has slippery slopes.
And what you mean by that maybe is, you don't want to say no miracles happen whatsoever.
Right.
But you also don't want to say, well, if we accept this icon thing, then suddenly I can teleport to McDonald's and get a burger right now.
Yes.
Right? So let's zoom out a bit, because one thing from the history of miracles that you gave in Christianity in your book was I was pretty surprised by the historicity of certain miracles or certain supernatural events. So one example is the counts of levitation at least peaked, right, in this sort of pre-modern era. And then you have witch hunts in a specific era. And you have, for example, the mass hysteria, the mass possession. That's also very localized in time. What do you make of the historicity of these miracles, that they seem to pop up grouped together in different historical epochs?
Yeah, well, fact is that cultures give shape to these phenomena. And there is a strong correlation between belief in the possibility of phenomena and the occurrence of phenomena. So, for instance, this Virgin Mary apparition in Cairo, of course, the Orthodox and Coptic churches have a tradition of this. So that's kind of built in, that someone might see the Virgin Mary. But then that doesn't explain how 1 million people see the same thing. And the fact remains a wild fact, which gives trouble. It's troubling in the sense that it can't be pigeonholed. You can't find a niche into which to place it. And William James spoke of wild facts that he was researching. Because in his book, Varieties of Religious Experience, as a philosopher and a psychologist, he realized that religious experience is a phenomenon that cannot be denied. So he paid a lot of attention to these mystics who had ecstasies, physical phenomena, so on. And he spoke of these wild facts. That was his term, wild facts, that just baffle everyone because they don't fit into our view of the world and they cannot be explained. But there's another social scientist, Emil Durkheim, who came up with the concept of the social fact, that there are social facts. Social facts are ideas or beliefs that shape people's thinking and behavior. And they are facts, even though some of them are really just beliefs, such as perhaps the best known one in the United States. All men are created equal. My God, it governs American history from the day it was written. This has governed American history and American politics. Well, how do you interpret this? And it's just a belief. As a matter of fact, when Thomas Jefferson wrote those words, that's not what most of the world believed.
Right. Well, but this explanation of the historicity of miracles, right, it almost lends to the mass delusion, mass psychosis kind of reading of miracles. I thought that you were going to say something different, which is that there is a historicity to the miracles themselves. Like, for example, in the first century, God, the Protestant view is God used miracles to show the legitimacy of his messengers. And then maybe there was a specific reason for levitation in the 17th century. But that's the alternative, I suppose, religious reading, right? That there is a historicity because religion is historical and so are the miracles associated with it.
Right. But they do show up in clusters. Both chronologically and geographically. There are cluster points in the graph, the chronological graph, and there are also clusters if you try to map these things. And there are always a very strange relation between the social facts and the wild facts. And the wilder the fact, the more difficult it is to see a relationship between the wild fact and the social fact.
Right, like levitation, for example, right? And so you almost want to affirm both the secular and the religious intuition in this sense. The religious intuition is that, no, these are miracles. Like the testimonies, they're not, or the more believable ones, they're not just lying. But the secular reading is that it's because of these social facts that they. And you almost want to affirm both intuitions and suggest that there might be some mysterious connection between the two. That I'm just going to posit one suggestion, like God only allows levitation in communities that already believe. There's something like that, right?
Yes, I think you're right. I think that both possibilities have to be taken seriously. That both the social fact and the beliefs within the social fact create these clusters. In the case of levitation, if we stick just with that phenomenon, these individuals who end up levitating, overwhelming majority of them are monastics, men and women who dedicate their entire lives to praying, fasting, denying themselves all sorts of gratification. They're like athletes, for heaven's sakes. They've trained themselves to have transcending experiences because they're constantly praying. Each and every one of them has had a life where they have been building up to this happen. And all of them do this in a certain social matrix, right, which is the monastic community. The word for self-denial, asceticism, comes from the Greek word askesis, which is a word that has origins in the Olympic Games. Askesis is training. So these are individuals who train themselves and to transcend this world. Because what else is prayer?
Right.
Prayer is trying to communicate with some other dimension. So they've trained themselves. One could even say they've trained their brains physically.
Right.
Part of Christian asceticism is identical in Asian religions.
Right.
This belief that if you suppress your sensual desires, your spiritual self becomes stronger. This is shared by all
Right. Mystical tradition.
mystical and monastic traditions, and it's global,
Right.
this assumption. So what happens when the number of monks and nuns decreases?
Right. And so this is one suggestion you're making about how the social and wall effect ties together, which is,
Right.
let's say that the cause of levitation is this monastic mind practice, which you're right, is very similar to Buddhism. The social fact of there being decreasing amount of serious monastics could explain, in this case, the wild fact of there being less levitators, right? Fascinating.
And also the 16th, 17th century. There's a lot of religious tension. And many historians of witchcraft attribute the witchcraft persecutions to this religious tension. My God, there's so many horrible things going on. And such violent disagreements about what is true, or let's say true with a capital T, right? On the Catholic side, it's easy to see how that fact alone can intensify the efforts of these monastics to pray more,
Right.
eat less, and so on. Because, for instance, Teresa of Avila mentions quite often how bad she feels for those Lutherans who are all going straight to hell. And how she prays for them. She's trying harder just so that they...
I see. There's another dimension of the miraculous I want to explore, and that's its intersection with technology. Because towards the end of the book, you described how, funnily enough, around the time that Saint Joseph was made into a saint, the first hot air balloon ride took place. And the experience there was almost as shocked and amazed as witnessing Saint Joseph's alleged levitations. And there's a saying in the technology industry that good technology is like magic. And the closest experience I've had in my life of witnessing this miraculous icon is seeing this new generation of large language models of AI for the first time, where you can just ask it a question and it just responds to you as a very well-trained professor, perhaps. So tell us about how technology and the miraculous, and how these two spheres interface with each other in the modern
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I say the first man to go up in a hot air balloon is the first certifiable levitator, seen by hundreds of people. So you have a technological change that allows for things to happen. But of course, the technological change is not allowing it to happen in the same way.
I mean, this is preternatural, not supernatural.
That's right. And there's an intermediary, the balloon and the basket. However, this was brought to my attention very recently. The way that modern science conducts its experiments with technology is that they put nature through unnatural circumstances. So, for instance, you need equipment to let you see something that you cannot see nature do.
Right.
So like the Large Hadron Collider, which I don't understand whatsoever.
Right.
Right?
They make particles go unreasonably fast, right?
Yes, particles that nobody can see. It's amazing. But I always think of, we have no way of making people levitate with any kind of equipment. But we can make trains levitate. And we can make, actually There's magnetic levitation and there's sonic levitation. You can make small insects levitate with sound waves. I've seen the photos and videos, right? You can. In the same way, artificial intelligence is putting thought, literally, through a different medium. And that medium, to some extent, is also dealing with something invisible.
Well, once you put it that way, the human's manipulation of technology almost reminds me of the devil's manipulation of nature. That it's because of our oldness and all this knowledge that we've collected, that we through these preternatural ways, right? These natural but hypernatural ways that we manipulate nature.
And there are many laws of nature that modern present-day science still doesn't have. And even things that are brought to light by new technologies that make science question its previous assumptions. The James Webb Telescope being the most recent example that, a wide number of people know about. Astronomers, astrophysicists don't know what to make of these galaxies that they're seeing through the James Webb Telescope. And actually, I saw this, some scientific journal, when those images first came out, published an article, the first word of which was panic, ! Right.
Like my reaction to seeing the icon.
Yes, your reaction to the icon is, oh, wow, what? Yeah. I am reminded of the way in which infrared light was first detected. It was accidental. Thermometers were placed that got a nice prism and a nice long light spectrum. And thermometers were placed in each section of the light spectrum. And as a control, a thermometer was placed outside the spectrum, but not too far outside. And, well, it turns out there's not that much of a temperature difference between the different colors. But the control thermometer went up by several degrees, which led to only one rational conclusion.
Right. There's light we can't see.
Yeah, there's light we can't see that actually has a temperature.
Right, I see. Let me give you a quote from your book. At exactly the same time that Catholics were canonizing levitating saints and burning flying witches, modern empirical science was emerging and creating paradigm shifts of its own. For some quirky set of reasons then, the peak period for flying humans in Western history coincides with the initial development of a new materialistic way of thinking about reality that would reject all this flying as absolutely impossible nonsense. The supernatural played one hell of a role in the birth of modernity during the 16th and 17th centuries, that era also known as the Age of Reason.
Yes.
Why was the Age of Reason, the age of science, of the empirical methods, also the time with the heightened and most exaggerated accounts of the miraculous?
Well, again, we go back to the chaos and tension of the period. And the fact that so many lines are being redrawn, so many metaphysical and epistemological rules are being shuffled, and beliefs are being challenged. So it's messy. It's very, very messy. And, when I was in school, I got this version of history that, the Age of Reason and the birth of science are a straight line, a straight upward line leading to the present and to infinite progress. But it wasn't that neat. It was very messy.
Right.
Very, very messy. And, you have individuals like Blaise Pascal, who great scientist, great mathematician, but very much a believer in the miraculous. As a matter of fact, he was something of a mystic himself. And in addition to being a gambling addict, who came up with probability theory as a way of hedging his bets, literally, left behind this little piece of paper inside his coat detailing a mystical experience that he had. So, and he and Descartes hated each other. absolutely hated each other and had nothing nice to say about each other. So these two people cohabit the earth.
Let me make a geopolitical analogy. There's a saying where some decades, nothing happens. And then there are some days in which decades happen. It's a talk about where when war spreads out, for example, in our world, like me growing up, never experienced any warfare. And then suddenly you have Ukraine and Russia, you have Israel and Palestine, and the world is becoming kinetic again, right? And unfortunately, I think. It's almost like that, but with epistemic thought in this early period, in this beginning of the Age of Reason, which is there was an earthquake in the epistemic realm. And both the miracles as well as empirical science were these early gasps, these early troops moving into their new territories, trying out their new positions in the world. But of course, the empirical side obviously won out. Is that a fair way to understand it?
Yes, I think so. I think so. I think that's a very nice image too.
Right. And I think it's very interesting because the reason I got interested in miracles to begin with was through my study of science. I was a STEM major. I went to the engineering school at Columbia. And it was by understanding how limited science's conception of the universe was. A good example would be dark matter, right? About 60, 70% of the matter in the universe, we can't account for its gravity. So we just call it dark matter. But what I found extremely odd in the academy today is despite how science admits its own limitations, the scientific assumptions are held with a religious fervor, meaning the kind of reductionism, the materialism, the fact that everything is governed by laws. And it was because of that mismatch that via negativa, I thought, well, I think science must be missing something. And so I started looking into all this phenomenon, including on the Buddhist side and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that there's a rational side, very definite, rational, logical dimension to believing possibility of things that modern science has declared impossible.
Right.
I have run into this conundrum, which is that the fact that I mention levitating trains and human levitation as coexisting in our day and age upsets some people and actually think that there is no connection. They get very angry. A few people have gotten really angry with me because they say there is no connection between electromagnetic levitation and these levitations. And I'm thinking, phenomenologically, they're the same phenomenon. Why is it inconceivable that, yes, they are the same thing? And that ultimately, you could also make this argument metaphysically and scientifically. Perhaps all of these levitations that I investigated have no supernatural cause whatsoever. It's that it's purely natural.
Right. And we just don't understand it yet.
We just don't know how to, which is not my argument, by the way, and it's not my argument at all. I just think that it's modern science keeps pointing us ever more vigorously towards conceiving of reality as multidimensional.
Right. Even quantum mechanics, right? And the conclusions or some of the possible conclusions that come out of that seem miraculous or religious or completely impossible to someone steeped in, for example, Newtonian physics.
That's right. I keep coming back to the James Webb Telescope because here is a current day instance of the paradigm is shifting. Kuhn, what was his first name? Who wrote
Thomas Kuhn.
Thomas Kuhn. Right. Yeah, about the way in which science develops is by redefining paradigms. There is no end. There's no end stop. You just keep finding more different things than you expected, and then the paradigms have to change.
Right. I want to move on to the last conversation of this interview, which is one of the primary reasons why I was interested in miracles. So I mentioned one of the secondary reasons was I was suspicious of the modern scientific frame. But the primary reason was because I grew up Protestant and I was a lapsed Christian for all reasons we can go into. And then I became interested in Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism specifically, in college. And the issue for me was I find both traditions quite compelling, and I find them both quite internally coherent. And so for me, I don't have a problem with faith as an epistemic mode at all, but my question has always been leap whither. Like I think in many ways, Kierkegaard's decision in Europe at the time of jumping to Christianity, right, the leap of faith, is a lot easier than my decision of not only making the leap, but choosing leap whither. And so I looked at, I studied its philosophy, the theologies of respective religions, the historical accounts, and to me, they set up a position of equipollence. Like there was a direct tension. There was these two, what I thought to be mostly coherent systems that disagreed, right, on the very fundamental questions that they wanted to answer. And so I always hoped that a miracle would be a way for me to arbitrate between these religions. And it's funny, after the first few days of seeing this icon, I was like, well, clearly Christianity is it, right? Because it's not like levitation. The nice thing about the icon is pretty unambiguous, right? It's a picture of the Virgin Mary holding Jesus, and it responds to the Christian liturgical calendar. But then I think this miracle, and also your book, made me more open to all accounts of miracles, even within the traditions that I'd explored before, like Buddhism, but had more eagerly dismissed. And so in the last few days, I've been asking my Buddhist friends and masters I had studied with, and they all gave me direct testimony that they saw levitation, that they saw some miraculous thing happening. And so now I'm stuck again, but I'm stuck again within the miraculous realm. Well, it didn't help me in the way it did.
Well, choices have to be made simply because traditions are so different in some respects, no matter how many similarities they share. And to a certain extent, this is something that scholars who work on mysticism, right, deal with this. Why is it that there are so many similarities between mystical experiences across religious traditions, but yet the individual mystics only experience
their version of
their tradition? One scholar, Yuri Christo, wrote this article back in the late 70s, early 80s, in which he said that mystics have specific horizons, and that's their religious tradition. And they can only experience what is within their horizon. That made sense to me. Does that mean that this is true and this is not true? I think that paradox is central to Christianity. I think paradox is also central to most major religious traditions.
Right.
And it's a paradox, a mystery. In the same way that Christians, Orthodox and Catholic Christians, are asked to believe that God is three in one.
Right, yeah.
There's only one God, but he's three also, simultaneously. Right. How does one explain that? You can't.
So maybe your response is to what I was saying, that, at most, either Christianity or Buddhism is true, right? They could both be false. But you're almost suggesting maybe there's a paradoxical way in which they both could be true, but just in a way that you haven't comprehended yet. Or is that what you're suggesting? To be open to these experiences and not try to want to make these definitive semantic judgments.
Yes, and the beauty of any religion, right? Because in order for people to believe, there has to be an element of beauty in the religion. Even if your religion is like a dualistic religion that says, oh, there's a good God and a bad God.
Right.
There's a beauty to that. It kind of explains suffering in a very logical, reasonable way. But the beauty in each religion is that the deeper you get into it, the more that all beliefs, symbols, and rituals make sense.
Within their own tradition.
Within their own tradition, yes. And that's the beauty of it. And this is what keeps people in a specific religion.
Right.
But a lot of it, back to William James, a lot of it has to do with personal experience. What rings most true?
Right.
What rings most true to you with your personal history and your family history and everything else about you? That's the thing that makes conversions difficult sometimes.
Right.
Is your own history and your family history.
Right.
Being different from what seems so true to you.
But I feel like taking that position is already ceding a lot of ground in the sense that you mentioned in some of your historical books on Christianity, this kind of spiritualist take, right? This like what appeals to you, like what appeals to you. That's quite a modern understanding in the sense that I think for most of history, religion was what is right about the world, right? Like is God 3 in 1? Yes or no? Okay, he's 3 in 1. Like, and all the other economical councils, right? And all the other dogmas that they've established. And so, I'm a bit resistant to this kind of new agey.
I don't personally. I don't buy into this new agey thing at all. No,
right. You think there is a truth to the metaphysical things, right?
Truth. There has to be an element of truth,
right,
to all of these. Not just different religious traditions, but the people who believe in these things. There has to be an element of truth.
Right.
And I'll never forget what one of my philosophy professors in college said. He was a Jesuit priest, but he was teaching us metaphysics from the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition. He loved Aristotle. And one day after class, we were walking somewhere together, and he went like this with his fingers. And he said, I can't believe Aristotle came this close, this close to the truth. Right. He didn't have revelation. But the fact that he could come up this close, and he kept holding his fingers just like I am. He just would not let the fingers go. This close is...
right.
The admission made by all, within my own tradition, the Christian tradition, the Catholic tradition, is the admission made that, yes, there's a lot of truth out there in these other.
Right. But importantly, they don't have the full thing, right? They are this, at best, they're this close.
Right. That's why.
Right. Although I will have to say, first of all, I do agree with you that there's a lot of similar descriptions of mystical traditions, especially when it comes to levitation, because that's a very popular thing with Buddhism, for example, as well. And it's also very fascinating that the preconditions for it are very similar. For example, in your books, the only people who levitate are ascetics, essentially, right? People who deny themselves in some way and are monastics. Obviously, for Buddhism, that's a big part of Buddhist monastic practice as well. However, if we're just trying to arbitrate on the miracles, what struck me was how much more in control the accounts of Buddhist miracles are, if that makes sense. Like the Catholic miracles and the Christian miracles you described, they were all like Saint Teresa grabbing the table because she didn't want to be pulled up. Whereas the Buddhist accounts are all of the Superman saving the lamb kind of story, where they're flying around, they're going through walls. And it's interesting, right? Because in this book, the worldview you give is there's a natural world, right? And those operate by laws, and there's a supernatural world that can penetrate, that can override it. And this is God only in the Catholic world. When I asked the Buddhists about their miracles, this is a few days ago, they told me, they said, nothing is miraculous.
Right.
Everything is natural. Right. You're just not at the level to see the karma and see the laws yet.
It's like the film The Matrix.
Right.
Yeah. You have to cross over and you realize it's all
right.
It's all different from what you thought it was.
Right.
Well, I have received some very, very interesting emails in response to They Flew from individuals who are, testifying. Talk about testimonies.
Yeah.
Some of these emails I've received have shaken me up. I received one from an individual who claimed that he worked for the CIA doing remote viewing for over 20 years. And,
remote viewing is when you sort of like teleport yourself out of your own physical body and are able to see things.
see something very far away, which is like bilocation.
Right.
Basically, except the CIA and the KGB during the Cold War hired people we call psychics. These are not monks and nuns.
Right.
These are individuals who may not even be Christian or Buddhist or anything, but they claim to have these powers, which are natural powers. Anyway, this went on for over 20 years. And this man said, I was very, very impressed by an answer that Maria de Agreda gave to her bilocations when she was asked, how do you communicate with these people if you don't have their language? How do you communicate with each other? He said, I crossed over to the other side many times, and language was never a barrier.
This person claimed that
sometimes during remote viewing, he was there.
Right.
And communicated with people and exchanged information. Although the other person and he spoke different languages and didn't know each other's language.
Right.
That there was some like basic telepathy going on. And then he said, and I can put you in touch with other individuals who had the same experience.
Well, did you reach out to them?
No.
Don't you want to?
Part of me does, part of me doesn't.
Right.
Because I'm already so
convinced of, right.
And not only that, I just have too much going on in my life I know that's a big rabbit hole. I could very easily get lost in.
Yeah.
And right now I can't do that for various reasons.
Right.
Professional as well as personal.
Right.
I just can't go down that hole.
Right. But if we take the ability to use miracles and to manage miracles as a proxy for how good of a reality you have an understanding of, when you're just comparing miracles, it would seem the Buddhists would be closer to truth than the Christians. Because of how in control they are of similar miracles, if that makes sense. And let me give you one biblical account. So obviously, like we mentioned, miracles are not central to Christianity, right? Like they're not core to what the faith is about. But even in Exodus, for example, Moses performed certain miracles, and it is said that the Egyptian pharaohs, magicians, are able to match him up into a degree. And then the miracles that Moses does are greater.
Yes.
And so there is this logic of, comparing like your God against my God. Like it's so.
Of course. Yeah. And, in the 17th century, Catholic priests and Lutheran ministers actually had exorcism contests.
Really?
Yes. They didn't call them contests, but we can call them contests.
Right.
Who has the right stuff?
Like rap battles, but for exorcism.
Yes, yeah. What was that show that had battling robots?
Right, exactly, yeah.
Who has the right, literally, technology to exorcise this demon? Those early Christian had to deal with these magicians, these magi, and prove who had the right stuff.
But in this case, the Buddhists seem to be able to outdo the Christian miracle.
Well, in terms of voluntary command of nature, perhaps so, right? But it's two different conceptions, as you put it very, very, very nicely, of Christians believing that there's nature and supernature. And in the Buddhist tradition, I don't know enough about Buddhism, right? But the fact that my levitators cannot will to levitate, they cannot will to do any of these things. It's always a gift. There's two very different conceptions of reality.
Right.
And my psychic remote viewer who wrote to me, if I understand what was going on correctly, is that, these people had this talent that they could
cultivate,
Cultivate,
right?
yes, and train.
like bodybuilding, right?
Yes, yeah, and then be able to do this. All those CIA files are now at Rice University.
Right. And they're conclusive that remote viewing can be done?
They got hits. Yes, they got hits. They wouldn't have kept doing it for over 20 years if they didn't get correct information.
And this is all public. You can just go to Rice or...
You can go to Rice and look through the... Apparently, so I hear, it's a lot of shelf space. There's a lot of documentation.
Right.
This program was far larger than most people realize or can conceive of being.
Right. And so, stepping back a bit, from the Christian perspective, what is the role of miracles? Like, what is their purpose, especially when it comes to something like levitation that seems to serve no didactic or useful utility? Is it,
It's a manifestation of another dimension.
Right.
Another power.
Right.
That we just don't.
I see.
Don't understand. Because ultimately, within Christianity, the basic assumption is you have to make that Kierkegaardian leap.
Right.
It's all much more complicated than your brain can ever comprehend.
Right. And miracles are a reminder of that.
It's real.
Right.
It's real. Look, it's real. Bilocation does serve purpose. Usually, place B, you're doing something. Right. Levitation is all show.
Right. I see. So let me try to push this argument to the other extreme, which is to say, well, why doesn't God reveal him in a less ambiguous way, more constantly, right? Like in the Old Testament, he comes out as a tornado saying that he is God. Why, if it's all benevolent, all powerful God, why not reveal himself in a more miraculous fashion?
Again, the basic assumption, which you see expressed in the book of Job in the Old Testament. Mm. Who are you to ask these questions? You're the pot made by the pot maker.
Right.
You don't ask the pot maker why, that's just the way it is.
Right.
It's a mystery. And this goes back to my own education. I realized at a very early age, because I went to Catholic school from 1st through 5th grade. Mm. Whenever there was a tough question from any kid in the class, the concerning religion, why is this? The answer was always the same. It's a mystery. It's a mystery. It's a mystery.
But there have been attempts, I think, of creating a theology of why God doesn't reveal himself more. And I think one example would be Pascal, that God is a hidden God for a reason, that he almost doesn't want to show himself too much because that would remove the basis or need for faith, or there have been arguments that are...
Pascal is very Augustinian, he's all wrapped up in the concept of original sin and the fall of the human race from its original condition, we're damaged goods. But actually that little scrap of paper sewn into the lining of his coat begins with the words, fire. Fire, fire. God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not of the philosophers. And then the word certitude. Like William James, kind of just got it that, religious experience to a certain extent is proof of the fact that there's more, but personal religious experiences are incommunicable. Right? You can't simply say to someone else, "Hey, I had this experience."
Right.
You should have it too.
Right. Because by definition, it's an experience, right?
Yes.
Right.
You can't
something private.
So,
right.
This is where monasticism people train to have these experiences.
Right.
They train themselves. Like you were saying, the Buddhist monks do this.
Mind training.
In India, the yogis do it. In the Sufis do it in Islam. The Kabbalists did it in Judaism.
Right.
Or still do.
Right.
There's a scholar of Jewish mysticism, who argues that there is no such thing as mysticism, singular, that one should only speak of mysticisms, plural, because each tradition has different experiences and different realities.
I see. I think I would like to end this interview now, but by quoting the end of your preface. Dealing with the impossible requires one to end up with more questions than answers. This can prove unsettling, but the best thing about all things truly unnerving and all things impossible and ostensibly supernatural, such as those that are the focus of this book, is the hard fact that none of these questions are trivial, even though our dominant culture aggressively suggests that they are. And I would say that, at least for me, your book has fully lived up to the goal. So thank you so much for opening a lot of non-trivial questions in my life.
Well, thanks for such a great conversation too. Thank you.
Thanks for watching my interview. If you want to go even deeper into these ideas, then join my email list at greatbooks.io. You'll not only get lectures and interviews, but also transcripts, book summaries, and essays, all to help you explore the most important books in history. If you like this interview, I filmed another with Professor Eire on Christian history that you probably enjoy. You can find links to that interview and everything we discussed today in the description, as well as on my website, greatbooks.io. Thank you.